right, we're returning to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It is warm in here. I'll have to talk to the people about getting some air conditioning for us a little bit. We're going back into the warm weather time. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We are not racing through this. You may have noticed. This is our third week. We've only covered 3 verses. And I'll let you know we're only going to cover 1 more today if I can move this along. That's all I'm shooting for. But before I get to that verse, what I'd like to do is take you all the way down to the end, the last verse in this chapter, because I want you to take a look and have an understanding of why this chapter matters. Paul lays this out for us here in verse 13 of chapter 13. Noise on the street. So now, faith, hope, and love abide. These 3. But the greatest of these is love. Paul says the greatest commodity in the universe is love. This is the greatest need. And this is why we're trying to understand it. I want you to look at a parallel passage with me, if you would, in 1 Peter chapter 4. Because Peter goes after the same thing and makes some of the same claims about this. In 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 7. Let's make sure I've got this right here. Chapter 4, verses 7. Yeah, starting, I got it right. The end of all things is at hand. There's a nice way to start, doesn't it? Sounds like somebody with a sign on the sidewalk. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, what does he say to do? Above all else, have fervent love, or keep loving one another. Above all, have fervent love. Keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. And then he's going to do some things. Notice what he's going to say. What does love look like? Here's what it says. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks is one who speaks the oracles of God. Whoever receives is one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. Notice what he says here. Love, he says, is the greatest commodity, and then he gives you examples of it. He gives you examples in the same exact context. Remember what our issue is here in chapters 12, 13, and 14 of 1 Corinthians. The issue is an abuse of something. What is Paul correcting? What's the problem? You remember this? Problems with the gifts of the Spirit. This is how they should work. And he's saying this. No matter what gifts you have, no matter what actions you're taking, if they're devoid of this character, the character he's going to define as love, they do nothing. What is Peter saying? In the same passage, this parallel passage. What's Peter's point?
Above everything. Doesn't matter.
Above everything. In other words, unless you add this ingredient to it, what's missing? Does any of this activity make sense? Does any of this activity do anything? Remember what Paul said in the first 3 verses we studied in chapter 13. If you add everything, great teaching, great theology, we have the best building in the world, we have every gift you could ask, and you take all that, add it together, and subtract love, how much do you have? Nothing. A fat goose egg, a 0. Take that out of the equation, and no matter what else is working, it's done. It's useless before God. As we've said, it is the purpose of the church to be the body of Christ in the world. That is, that we show the character of God. Now let me ask you, scripturally, how does God define himself?
God is love.
God is love. Where do you find that? 1 John, twice. God is love. That is the character of God. So if you're going to be the body of Christ, you must display that character. Now here's our problem. How do you define that? How do you do that? How do you get there? And this is the struggle that Paul is trying to get us through here. He's trying to get us to understand something that really, quite frankly, I don't think any culture has really captured well. And that is the ability to define love. Because Paul has talked about something. You find it in Romans, Paul says, he says, love is the fulfillment of the law. Where did he get that idea? Was that something Paul came up with on his own?
No.
Who said that first?
Jesus.
And do you remember the context there?
The two greatest commandments.
The two greatest commandments, he said. And what are the two greatest commandments?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Love the Lord your God.
God with all your heart, soul, and strength, right? And the second is akin to it, said Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. That's an interesting statement, because I want you to understand something. Understand Jewish thinking at the time. Jesus is saying all of the law is contained in these two statements. Now, the Jews had boiled their faith down to 613 commandments. 613, 365 negative, one for every day of the year, 248 positive. They had taken prayer tassels. You ever seen the prayer tassels they put at the four corners of the robe? You know what those were designed to do?
Keep you in the Word.
Remind you to keep thinking about the 613 commandments. That was your job. You spent your life memorizing, thinking about, reciting 613 laws. As we said, 365 negative, 248 positive. Jesus comes along and says, here's how you deal with the whole thing. Let me give you two. How many of those two were negative?
0.
None of them were negative. How do you sum up the negative and positive laws in two positive statements? How does that work?
Because when you love somebody, you want to do.
Okay, there's the positive. When you love somebody, you'll do the positive ones automatically because love acts in that way, yes?
I was about to say, if you love God, you will keep His commandments.
All right, so now we've done the positive. What about the negative?
We don't like to think of the negative.
Think in this terms. Love always wants to do the right thing, so you've covered the positive. But love also is contained by avoiding doing the wrong things. I want you to understand, Paul is going to define love for us in two ways. He's going to tell us what it does and what it doesn't do. He's going to define it for us in these two ideas, what it does and what it doesn't do. He's going to look through that and try to bring that in here. So understand this church. He says you come behind in no gift. Everything they needed, they had. He said you have great teaching. I've been there teaching. Apollos has been teaching. You understand this thing. But you're missing a key element. And he says you're missing love. And now we have to understand what that means. I want you to understand how difficult that is. Remember what we looked at last week? We pulled out Webster's dictionary. And you remember how it defined love? Anybody have a remembrance of how that came about?
Emotion.
Basically, emotion. I love it because, here you go. It basically said, love is when you love somebody. It had this circular thing. Love is loving. And you never get a definition of it. You never get down to anything that makes sense. It reminded me of watching that, I don't know if any of you guys saw this film that was put out by Matt Walsh called What is a Woman? It's an intriguing thing as he goes through this. He goes to people as he's talking to the trans community, and because everybody said, well, I'm a man to become a woman. And he asked this question, what is a woman? You know what the biggest answer was? A woman is someone who identifies as a woman.
Yeah, but what is that?
And that is, they couldn't answer. We have that problem with love in our culture. How much, have you noticed how much we write about this topic? We have poets beyond belief. It's in every song it goes on. I was just going on, I was just old 60s music. Petula Clark had one on there, my love is deeper than the ocean, wider than the sky, brighter than the brightest star that shines in the night above. And she went all these stuff. When she got all done, you go, and love is no idea. The poets waxed on and on about it. You could study them forever. We make rom-coms. There are whole industries for you ladies that, I shouldn't say that, but I have to, most of you buy. The romantic books are the biggest selling genre of books in the world. Love stories. They just go on about these things.
We just can't live up to that as men. So.
We can't even get the cool names they have in the book. I mean, very manly names. We don't have to. Someone gets stuck with Myron. That knows nobody and ever, no love interest in any of those books ever had that name. Just the way it goes. No clear definition, no author. We can't come up with any idea of breaking it down. And I'm going to tell you this. We come to chapter 13, and what you can expect me to say is this. Until Paul wrote this, we never had a definition of love. Paul does not give us a definition of love. Not in the classic sense of going, here's a two-sentence description and here's some synonyms so you know what the word means. Paul recognizes you cannot define love like that. It won't work. So Paul comes and says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to describe to you what it looks like when it's doing things. He's going to describe it as actions because he says you can't describe it through the conventional means of giving a description. You can't come down here and just say love is and give 3 synonyms and a 2-word thing and how you understand it. It won't work that way. It has to be an action. And that makes sense. Remember when Jesus said this in John 13, he said, they will know you are my disciples by what? The love that you show to what? Do you understand this? People can't look at us and see a philosophy. They can't look at us and see an idea. What can they look at us and see? What we do. It has to be defined in action. It has to be defined by how it does things. I'm going to tell you this. Unless there's a newer translation that changes this, the translation itself misses the point in every Bible you have in this room, I would be willing to bet you. Because all of the things here are adjectives in the English. Note that? It'll go through here, and they are all adjectives. In verse 4, if you would. The way of love, he talks about this. He'll say that love is patient, love is kind. These are all adjectives modifying a noun. And that is wrong because none of these Greek words are nouns. You understand something here? Each of these Greek words is what? A verb.
So it would be like love waits.
In other words,
No, that'd be still an
love is an act of kindness. Love is being patient. In each case, it is an action in view here, not an adjective. And I have not yet seen a translation that gets that. For some reason, we have to try to put it in adjective terms. It are verbs. Every one of these is a challenge to see how it is lived out. I want you to understand what Paul wants us to do here. As I said, Paul is not trying to define love. He's making this challenge. He's saying, this is what it looks like when it does things, and here's the challenge. When you look at your life, is that what you do? You understand that? So in each of these cases, here's the challenge before us. When we look at this, and Paul says, love is patient, love is kind. What does patience look like? How do you know when someone's being patient with you? What has to happen? When someone is kind, what does that look like? Do you see what I'm saying here? The challenge is to dig into the text and try to come up with an understanding of how it acts. Now, as he said, Paul's central thing is you have all this stuff going through. You've missed love, you lost the character, and you are not doing anything of value. And I think we've seen that. 12 chapters leading into this, Paul has gone through one problem after another. He says, you've taken my communion service and you've taken the Lord's communion service, you turned it into what? How was their communion done? A drunken party. You've taken my teachers. God has given teachers to this church, and what have they turned that into? Basically, personality cults. Everything you can see, they have twisted into something else, and Paul says it because you lack the character to understand how it works. And now he says, here is that character. Here's what it has to look like. And this is what we're going to take apart today. Very briefly, in verse 4, I want you to see, he's going to give us, starting here, 15 things that love is. Part of them are what love does, part of them are what love doesn't do, but there are 15 things that are actions that describe love. My ESV, the very first one says, love is patient. Anybody have a different word there? All have patient?
Suffers long.
Long suffering or suffers long. It is long suffering. Those mean the same thing. It is long suffering or patience. It's the Greek word makrothumio or makrothumia, and it's a very specific term. I want you to understand something here. When we think of patience, what do you think of patience? Give me an idea. What means patient to you?
Waiting.
Just the ability to wait. All right? What else?
Just stay calm.
Staying calm.
Not overreacting.
Not overreacting to things. Now, those are all right on patience, but this is very specific in this text. I want you to understand something here. It is not talking about the patience you have like you're out of work and you're patiently waiting and you're not getting worried. You're one of those people, God's going to provide and I trust God. There's patience there. That's one aspect of patience.
How about a traffic light?
Traffic light. You're not yelling at the light. You're not thinking, okay, patience. Yeah.
My Bible curriculum says patience is waiting with a happy heart.
Okay. I don't think that's right. And I understand why you want to put in that, but they're missing the point. This Greek word has a very specific meaning. It isn't patient with circumstances. It is patient specifically with people. The Greek text here talks about being patient with people. And that's an interesting one. The ability, and if you think about this, what's more annoying, circumstances or people? Okay? Hands down.
Well, also, it's got to be toward people because you can't love a traffic light.
Exactly.
You can only love something that can hurt you.
This is relationships. Love is about how we act with people. And so he chooses a specific term here that talks about this. Chrysostom, early church father, gave this definition to the Greek term. I want you to listen to this. It is the word which is used of a man who is wronged and has easily in his power the ability to avenge himself, but will not do it. Now, I want you to follow this. Patience is only patience in a situation this way. Someone has done something to tick you off, and you have the ability to get even, or better yet, get one up, and you don't. It's completely different than the situation where you have been wronged and can do nothing about it. Do you understand that? Guy says something to you, he's way in your face, he's acting the way he shouldn't, and you think he's 6'5", 270 pounds of muscle. I'm going to be patient on this one. That's not what it's talking about. It isn't that situation at work where if I open my mouth, I could lose my job. It's not that. It's this. You have it within your means to do something about it. And you don't. That's the issue here. Guy's picking on you, and you know this guy is verbally not my match. I could take him apart. If he wants to have a war of words, throw down. And you don't. It's the ability, it's that capacity to put a limit on what you're going to do. The insult that you're willing to bear, the attitude. Can you think of anything more contrary to our culture than that mindset?
So is this like turning the other cheek?
Even more so than that. And we're going to dig this down and find out, but you're getting to it. Exactly. The ability, which is to turn away from an insult. It's not talking about an assault, it's talking about an insult. The ability to bear up. Aristotle said this about the Greek culture. The great Greek virtue is the refusal to tolerate any insult or injury and the readiness to strike back at any hurt. Now, which one appeals to you more? Aristotle, or what we're seeing, isn't that where we live? Growing up, I read every Louis L'Amour book ever written. I love Louis L'Amour, and I admit I probably should, because almost every story was the same story with a different character. But it always came down, you had the stalwart hero who wouldn't take it, and if he didn't, he would stand up against the wrong, whether with his fist or with a gun, and he would demand that justice be done. My favorite was the Sackett series, because in that one, it wasn't always him. The whole family would come down on you if you crossed them, if you came at them. And we're calling the Sackett family, the clan's coming together. That's the mindset we like, isn't it? The guy who did, how many movies have you seen on that person that just strikes back against injustice and won't tolerate it.
The equalizer.
There you go. You have the equalizer. Something to put things in the right perspective.
Madam?
Yes.
Talking about movies. In World War II, in Love and in War. Have you seen them?
In love in the world?
In Love
And
and in War.
No.
I don't think I've seen that.
Beautiful.
Yeah, okay. I will put it on my list to do.
We'll have to talk to you afterwards.
Having a bit of a movie file, that's what I want to find there. That's all in the attitude.
Myron, I have a good example
Yes.
of this, what you're speaking of. We have 3 acres where we live, and John likes to plant pasture grass out in the field, holds the dirt down, and the goats and the horses can go have a snack. And we have a not so nice neighbor. Extremely not so nice. And he was out there on the tractor on our property, plowing up the ground and just doing his thing out there. And she came out of her house and yelled obscenities through the fence, took her hose and squirted John and the tractor, and he just kept about his business. I stood in the backyard, but I didn't know my mouth was open. Never acknowledged her, he just kept doing his thing. And I thought, wow, I wish I could be that way. I might have had to get off the tractor, but he just kept going, and I thought, wow, okay, that's cool.
The inclination is always
Yeah.
do something about it.
Cool in the office.
He cracked a couple teeth maybe, but.
I might have been willing to take the hose, but I probably would have had to do something to demonstrate mockery. I don't think I'd get a ball or soap out and go. Just to, something you could subtly shoot back, but that's the restraint not to do
Who can do
something.
that? I admire that.
And it's rare that we admire that.
Right, yeah,
We almost always want to admire the person who won't take it.
right.
In our culture, that's the whole thing. That all these groups that you see, all these activists, they're all mad about something and they're not going to take it anymore.
Right.
And that's the imagery we hold up as how people should act. It's making a completely different aspect
As a
here.
Christian, you
Myron,
shouldn't do that.
I think of Natalie and her parents. They had every reason to be angry with what happened to her, but they didn't.
No lawsuits against the doctor, no reprisals, nothing.
he's their good friend.
Yeah, they've actually continued to have a relationship with that doctor and continue to share the gospel with him. That is very different than how the world talks about this. Now, when you think about that, is there anything that is more the character of God than patience with people who deserve less? It is probably the greatest attribute to look at God and think of what he puts up with. I mean, the story of Israel. How many times did God have to say, please don't do that, please don't do that, please don't do that? How many times did he have to act to punish and then restore them and try to put that relationship back together? Is that not a parallel of our lives, if we're honest,
Absolutely.
of how we act and how we do things? Patience, the nature of God. Peter talks about that. God is patient, not wishing that any might perish. This one has always got me. Let's see if you have the same struggle with this that I did. Jesus is on the cross, and he is looking up, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Now, I want to ask you a question. Let's say justice came due, and charges were filed against the people that took an innocent man and put him on the cross. If you're on that jury, do you think any of them really didn't know enough about what they're doing not to be guilty? Could you find any of them innocent? Do you think there was a person present who didn't know there was an innocent man on that cross? Pilate knew it. All of the Jews knew it. You see it in their plottings. What's worse is if you read the text carefully, a number of the Jewish leaders had a strong suspicion that Jesus was exactly who he said he was, and they crucified him anyway. How can God, how can our Lord from that point say they don't know what they're doing? What does he mean by that?
The extent of it, not just the fact of who he was, but the eternal extent of what happens
There it is.
because of their choice.
The eternal consequences. He's going, they don't see the full picture that God sees. That is magnanimous. Because they knew enough for God to go, we're taking them all down. But you're right. That's what they missed.
That one moment changed
Everything.
forever.
And they didn't understand that. And for that simple reason, God would extend patience. He wanted to hold back and not bring down full judgment. That, to me, is staggering. The attitudes of being patient. There was a illustration in Dr. MacArthur's commentary I rather enjoyed that talks about two men, Theodore Parker and Robert Ingersoll. Anybody know Robert Ingersoll?
Atheist.
Famous atheist. Robert Ingersoll always liked to do speeches, and he would do a dramatic moment in all of his speeches. He would take out his watch, he'd put it down, and after attacking the Christian faith, he'd go, and I give God 5 minutes to strike me dead for what I just said. And that was his challenge. If God is so powerful, I give him 5 minutes, and he'd start the watch. Theodore Parker heard about this and chuckled and said, and did the gentleman think he'd exhaust the patience of God in just 5 minutes?
That's good.
There are things that God is willing to put up with. This is a historical story that has always hit me. I've saw it in a number of commentaries, and probably some of you are familiar with this. The story of Edward Stanton and Abraham Lincoln. Edwin Stanton, I should say, and Abraham Lincoln. You familiar with this one?
Yeah. Always.
It's an entirely interesting story. Stanton hated Lincoln and was a political opponent and mocked him incessantly. And he said that no man needs to go to Africa to see a gorilla when there's one right here in Springfield, Illinois. He thought Lincoln was an absolute buffoon, detested the man, and Lincoln was elected to president, much to Stanton's distress. He hated that. War breaks out with Lincoln, and he needs a war minister. Anybody want to guess who he appointed to his cabinet as his war minister? Edwin Stanton. His rest of his cabinet was aghast. They're going, this man hates your guts. Why would you appoint Edwin Stanton? Why can't you get an ally? Anybody take his response?
If he hates that much, then we should go get him. No.
Yeah, for war, this guy's perfect. No, he said this. He's obviously the most talented and best man for the job. Through the years they worked together, Stanton never, ever appreciated Lincoln's politics. On the night that Lincoln was shot, Stanton was one of the few men in the room as he died. And Stanton made this comment: there lies the greatest leader of men the world has ever seen. Patience changed his mind. Patience rewrote history in that aspect of things. We look at patience, and I'll come to this, turning the other cheek. I would wish that Jesus had stopped there, because by the time I get to the second cheek, I'm out of cheeks. And now, if he hits me again. But Jesus has another story that messes that up. You remember this one? The disciples come to us, Jesus, if a person wrongs us, how many times should we forgive them? You remember the number they put out? 7 times? 7. I want you to understand the context here, because this is important. They're talking about someone who does the exact same thing to you 7 times. It's not a person who does 7 mistakes. It's the same mistake again and again and again. Now, how do we feel about people that continually come back and say, I'm sorry, and then do it again? Don't we have an old saying about that? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Yeah, well, after the second time, the other way around. I got it the other way. Yeah, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I shouldn't put up with it the second time. I've had enough. So Jesus goes, no, not 7. 70 times 7. And again, understand the context, for the same thing. He's talking about someone doing the same thing again and again.
And you know that if that was a 24-hour period, less than 3 minutes, in less than 3 minutes, they would do it again.
Yes.
That's how many times?
Yeah, and because it starts with the context, in a day. If a person does this in a day, So he breaks it down. How many of you are ready for it? It's okay, I'll let it go every 3 minutes. That's just stunning to me. I couldn't.
Give you, but you're not genuine.
All right, so we look at patience, and that's pretty impressive. Acts of patience, putting up with things and not retaliating. But God isn't going to let you just get away with, I won't do anything back. Try this one. What's the next one we're supposed to do in verse 4? Love is not only patient, it is an act of kindness. Try this one. Jesus said, not only put up with it, but in return for what they're doing, you seek ways to serve them and seek their good. You're going to treat me like dirt, and I'm going to find, what can I do to help him? That's a challenge, isn't it? An act of kindness.
And sometimes that takes lots of thought.
Sure
You
does.
try to figure out how you can do something to be kind.
What can I do to be kind? What deeds of service can I put in there? Kindness is an action. It's interesting to note in 1 Peter 2:3, where it says that God is gracious. The word gracious there is the same word here. God is kindness. God is defined by acts of kindness. That's what I find astounding. In Matthew 11:30, when Jesus said, my yoke is easy, you know what the word for easy there is? Same word, kindness. I want you to think about that. Jesus says, my yoke is kindness. Now, what's a yoke? Everybody, say, we have our farm show. What's a yoke?
Goes around the oxen and that.
Yeah, this is the big thing, so that you can attach something to a plow, a cart, whatever. That's how you burden the oxen with what you make it to make it pull. And Jesus says you're going to have a yoke. Life has things that have to get done. But unlike everybody else's yoke, my yoke is marked by acts of kindness. Do you understand the distinction in life he's saying? All of you are going to have life to deal with, but a life under me comes guaranteed with acts of kindness from me continually. That's the promise of Christ in our life. Kindness, simply starting to deal with help for others. I found this interesting. I was researching this aspect of kindness, looking for acts of kindness, and there was a study that just came out where they're looking at what makes for long-term relationships, what keeps marriages together. And I found it intriguing because they were doing this because marriage right now has become, for the first time in our history, a majority of younger people are not planning to marry at all. We finally tipped over to the number of young people that don't want to get married. Marriages don't last very long. So they asked, what is it that makes marriage work? How is it you find these couples? And they weren't looking for super. I think the starting point was like 10 years. To them, that's a long-term relationship. But they looked at 10, 20, 30, 40 years out. They found that overwhelmingly, when asked, how is it that you have stayed together and stayed happy in this relationship, that the same answer came out as to why it worked. And they all said this, acts of kindness. I want you to think about this. Why would that be the key to a great relationship?
Well, because behind kindness comes forgiveness.
Okay.
If I don't feel like being kind to you because you've hurt me, I still like to do it because that's Christ forgives me, I forgive you.
Okay, so it comes forgiveness. You're willing to move on and still do acts regardless of what it may have hurt. Yeah.
It diffuses.
It also diffuses things. You tend to overlook errors, don't you? And they weren't big acts. Yeah,
It's
go
part
ahead.
of God's definition.
That's what I was going to say.
It's God. God is a person that does kind things. And they were all little things when they were asked to give examples of acts of kindness. It wasn't some dramatic story. You know what it was? Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, kindness is also, it's beyond just the contract of marriage. It's going out to show your love, going out of your way to do things. That's what really makes it he or she actually does love me, actually does care about me.
I see actions that back up those words. It does that. The examples of acts of kindness were simple things. One person said this, I came home and it had been a really long work week, and my wife had gotten the kids together and they'd gone out and done all the yard work and said, you've had a tough week, we wanted to take care of that for you. And to him, that was huge. He hadn't asked anything, he hadn't expected it, and he was planning to do it, and they had just, on themselves, taken it to do that. Here's one of the biggest ones they said. Something happens in the middle of the night, And my spouse, my husband, my wife, was the one that said, I'll take care of it. Don't lose your rest. That was a big deal to people. The willingness to say, I'll do it, don't get up. Little things like that. Another one said, I was just amazed because he always stops and he sees something that he knows I might like, and he just brings it home and says, this is something I saw you might like. Little things made all the difference in having long-term relationships. Kindness.
Doing the dishes.
What's that?
Doing the dishes.
I can go back to that. That was an old study, and I haven't seen that in a while. But they were asking for what made for a sexy person in your relationship. What made a man sexy? And the number one answer for women was a man willing to do the dishes. That blew me away. That was the highest number of a woman would say that the husband's willing to do the dishes. Makes him look great.
Looks better and better.
Yeah, suddenly that's Paul Newman in his prime, you know? You just look at that. Yeah.
We took Mom to the gravesite of Dad yesterday up in Arvin, and she was telling us about times where he had gotten her flowers.
Yeah.
She had brought a plastic flower to stick next in this national cemetery where all the stones are the same, and it's just one after another the same. And we get to his stone, and there's these little weeds all over the place in the rocks, but we get to his stone, and there's this bigger weed right in front of it.
The only one that.
The only one. And she had brought this little plastic red rose thing, or whatever. So I stuck it in there, right? And she goes, let me just tell you about this guy in flowers. She said and she told us my story, but one she told us was, he didn't have anything one day, and he couldn't drive, so he took this little, arrangement.
Her decoration.
Her decorations inside her house, and he clipped off one of the flowers in the plastic arrangement, left a stem about this high, she said, and he came to give that to me. She goes, I was so mad, but then it was like the sweetest thing. She was so contorted, emotionally about it. It was funny.
But it was hilarious.
It was a good day.
Little things. And again, it comes down because it shows a care that is tangible. You can sing the Petula Clark song, you can write poems, but the bottom line of when it works is when someone sees you purpose to act to do something that you didn't have to do. And in each case, the act of kindness it's something I knew he didn't have to do. She didn't have to do that. I'd never asked, and they did it anyway.
And there is something about the thought that counts. That's part of it, is that they were actually planning and thinking of you ahead of time.
Let's see if we can actually get through verse 4. We've seen two things that love does do. Now here's something it doesn't do. Love does not envy. Anybody have another word for envy? Jealousy. Love does not have jealousy to it. Jealousy. I want you to think about that word a little bit. Is this one, again, one of the more natural things? How do we feel? We know this is a basic element of our thinking. Any teacher knows this. How do the students feel about the best student in the class, the one that always gets the A? Yeah, would you guys knock it off? Can you just bomb one test once in a while for me? You don't care for that. You're at work, and you have worked hard. There's an advancement coming up. One person's going to get it, and it turns out not to be you. How thrilled are you for the other person? And they've just been sick a few more times last year, broken a leg, nothing big, I don't want him to die, but, well, that is a thought. Now we have attitudes in it. We don't tend to like that one. Solomon called it rottenness of the bones. An old Latin proverb called envy the great enemy of honor. I got a kick out of Carrie Fisher, of all people. I found this quote from her. Carrie Fisher, great theologian, everybody knows that. Yeah. No. Said this: resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. It's like drinking poison and waiting. It's a rottenness inside yourself. You're destroying yourself with this, with envy. Envy, that jealousy, it eats us alive. It's always working in our relationships. I found this an interesting one. They found this in looking at high school and college-age girls especially, that most girls tend to try to make friends with girls who are less attractive and less capable than they are. Try this one. Bosses tend to try to hire people that are less talented than they are. Now, why would you do that?
To make yourself look
Sure, you're
better.
the shiniest one in the
Yeah,
room.
I gotta be the shiniest one in the room, and I can't have somebody upstaging me. There's a tendency to go in that. I love this from Benjamin Franklin. If you want to find a girl's faults, praise her to her girlfriends. Suddenly her friends will let you know. You ever had run into that? You know, she is one of the nicest people I've ever met. And then you go, yeah, but you don't know her like I do. And out it starts to come. And you're her friend, you know, you're close, you know it. I thought Franklin's dead on with that one. That's how we tend to do things. It's a common practice for us to hate. Go back to this. It's at the root of sin itself, isn't it? What was the temptation to Eve?
You be like God.
You can be like God. What was the implication in that?
You're not getting what you could be.
Yeah, God's holding out on you. God has something that He won't let you have. The Greek word literally means to boil. To boil. You're just cooking in it. Envy and strife. That's what Paul says about it. You have envy and strife, because strife always follows envy, doesn't it? You're going to have problems. George, let you go, and we're almost done here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, George.
Oh, George.
Go through Scripture, you can find it through. It was the sin of Eve. Why did Cain slay Abel? Jealousy. Why did Joseph's brothers throw him in the pit and sell him into slavery? Jealousy. All kinds of things. Why did Saul hate David, who saved his bacon by killing Goliath? Jealousy. Here's someone in Scripture that doesn't get a lot of credit. I think one of the deepest people in terms of character was Jonathan.
Yes.
Jonathan, why did Saul hate David? David was more popular, and he thought David was going to do what? Take the throne. Did Jonathan have a course in the race too?
Yes, it is. Being the son of the king.
Son of the king. That's my throne coming up. And this shepherd kid. But what was Jonathan's attitude toward David?
Love.
Love David, like a brother. Never did a thing. That's character, isn't it? The ability to set that aside. How many of us want to do that? I mean, we always like talented people. Hey, we're on the choir, we got great, and we could use some more voices. As long as those voices aren't better than mine. I want good voices, not that good. I want more teachers in the church, as long as not as good. I want them taking. I don't mind if they take other people, but don't follow anybody in my class. We have that. It's one of the hardest things to cope with. Is this aspect of envy, jealousy. I love it says, love his faith, does not envy, and is not arrogant. We'll get to that one, and we're not going to go. But envy is an amazing thing. There's a reason that basketball teams have a hard time putting more than one superstar on the team.
Not enough touches.
Easier on football because you have 22 players, a little easier to break it out. But where you have people doing some of the same jobs, very hard. Egos don't go. There's a reason you don't see many movies anymore that say all-star cast, and it's not the cost. You know what the biggest problem they have when they try to cast all-star cast?
Egos.
Who's going to get top billing? What scenes am I going to get? Am I going to have more screen time than such and such? And they have a hard time doing this. I'll end with this. This was an interesting story. Being a basketball fan, Michael Jordan, I'm sure you know, 6 rings, Chicago Bulls were the team of the 90s. When Michael Jordan left, another player became the star player for the Bulls, Scottie Pippen. There was a game in which they were coming down and they had to take one shot. They had to set up one shot to win the game. And this coach wanted to use Pippen as a decoy so they could get another man open for the shot. And Scottie Pippen said, I won't play.
I'm not going out.
He sat down and refused to play unless he could make the winning shot.
And the other guy did make the shot, by the way.
And the other guy sank the shot, by the way. Yes, okay. A Bulls fan would know that. Envy is one of the hardest things to recognize in ourselves. And it's one of the hardest things to overcome.
Yeah, you say that, and that was what made Jordan so great, was he learned that he couldn't do it all and he needed other players. Took less money, and he did everything that most guys. that
His
were the
greatness
best.
came when he changed his game.
Right.
It really did. Although I do know this, Jordan made a point with the coach of saying, I will be the leading scorer. So he didn't quite get over all of it.
Right, well, I mean, yeah, ego, but I'm just saying that
Yeah.
everybody beat him for 6 years. You know, they couldn't win anything.
Yeah, he was told there's no I in win.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, no I in team, or was it? He goes, there's an I
I
in
think
win,
it's
that's what it
team.
was.
There's an
There's
I
no
in-
I in team, he goes, but there is.
There's an
just
I in win, yes. So he still struggled with that. I hope you're getting where we're going with here. In each of these things, the challenge is to look at how life is lived and the character that someone shows. You cannot define love, you can only see it in action. And in each of these cases, I think you see, here's the hardest part. We see very easily when others aren't showing it. Paul's challenge is, how capable are we of seeing it when we're not showing it? I think we all know that person could have been more loving. They could have been kinder. They could have shown less jealousy. They could have done a lot of things. But the challenge for Paul is, have you taken any honest look at yourself? And how do your actions match up? Okay, we'll close this up. Questions or comments as we close this out before you sweat away on this